They came to my house twice in one day. The first time it was Jennifer at 4:03 p.m., her eyelashes smudged as if someone had wiped away the careful lines she kept for public moments. She had a key, used it without knocking, and that small, casual impoliteness told me more than the thousand words she didn't say. She dropped her purse by the entrance like she'd been carrying too many things for too long, and then she folded into the couch the way you fold into an old chair, cautiously, as if testing whether it would still hold. "Dad," she said, and it was a broken thing, a fragment of a voice filtered through some machinery of shame or panic. Her hands trembled. She kept them close to her face like a child holding a secret. "What happened?" I set the blueprints aside without looking. Old habits die hard, but my eyes watched her like a man who can read the lines of a city plan and know which columns will carry the load. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, cutting the room into bars. Dust hung in the air and made angelic lines when it hit the light. Outside, the neighborhood felt ordinary. Inside, the ordinary had rasped away. "It's Brian," she whispered. He's in trouble." I listened. She spoke in fragments at first, promises that were never kept. A poker room full of faces that bent toward money like jigs toward a dropped steak. The number came out only when she could no longer pretend that words could soften it. $87,000. It landed in the air between us like a dropped tile. My grip tightened on a ceramic mug that I hadn't realized I'd picked up. Its warmth spread through my palm like an accusation. 5 years ago, before the wedding, I'd told her he wasn't ready, that he liked the shape of big things and not the work of building them. I had said it plainly then, maybe too plainly, and she had called me controlling and unromantic. I'd been wrong about some things. I'd been right about this one. Brian had an appetite for expensive tastes and a talent for promising more than he could deliver. "Go home," I said, the words soft. "Rest. I'll handle this." She hugged me like you hug someone who might be the last solid thing you know. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, and when she left, the house door clicked shut at 4:03 p.m., and I watched her car recede down the street until it was nothing but a rectangle on the horizon. Then I returned to the blueprints, my old reflex, and the silence that filled the house like water. The day felt heavier then, as if gravity had learned a new trick. The second visit at 7 p.m., the darkness outside had weight. Brian walked in like he owned the place. He'd chosen his entrance. No knock, just the decisive swing of a man who expects life to move where he points it. He wore a pressed shirt and an expensive watch, the type of watch you buy when you want time to announce your status for you. He sat across from me with his arms flung along the back of the chair, like a monarch who had not learned humility. "Let's skip the small talk," he said. "I need $100,000. He wasn't begging. He was making a transaction with a look that said the balance had already tipped. He explained his timeline, 5 days. He explained his consequences. Some men who did not like to be crossed. It was not a physical threat, not with rope and broken bottles. It was a threat that worked on people softer than me, on daughters and husbands and fathers who loved. He knew that the most effective weapon was not a fist. It was fear. He thought that because I was an old man, I would fold. People always underestimate the skills they can't see. Architecture is a slow, patient craft. We design structure so it will outlast impatience. 35 years of solving other people's problems had taught me about tolerances, about where to put load and how to plan a collapse, so it happened only when you wanted it to. 5 days, I said. I'll need time to gather that amount. Smart choice, he said, and left. When Brian's car started and the sound walked away down the drive, I didn't move. I sat on that couch and listened to the echo of his confidence. Then I stood and walked to my office where the safe lived behind a framed photograph of the first community library I'd ever built. My hands found the combination by habit. The safe breathed open, deeds, contracts, folders of proposals, projections. I pulled out a folder labeled Phoenix Development Projects, work I'd done in the years before I decided to retire. I had considered one last investment then, and the memory of that decisionless day had the taste of missed blood. I'd chosen to enjoy what I'd earned. Now I decided differently. I called Kevin Foster, my old partner, who stayed in the game when I'd walked away. He answered on the second ring. He always had. Can we meet tomorrow morning? 7:30, usual spot, I said. He was there, coffee already waiting in the corner booth, when I slid in. Kevin was a man who still smelled of the market, someone who could read an opportunity like a blueprint. Over coffee, he slid a listing across the table. 3.2 acres on the east side, cheap. Pennies because it sat on the wrong side of Highway 60 and had no utilities. The city council was rumored to be rezoning adjacent parcels for commercial use. In 12 months, it could triple in value. The listing number stuck in my head like a nail. It is a peculiar pleasure, this work of waiting. There is a kind of engineering to the human mind. Predict the load, place the reinforcements, and then allow the structure to do what structures do. Brian wanted a quick fix. He wanted cash, and he wanted it now. I had time. I spent Thursday and Friday drafting terms. The law, thankfully, is a kind of grammar that lets you put meaning into the world. I met with Craig Adams, my estate attorney. I asked very precise questions and got very precise answers. If I loaned money to a married couple, could it be secured against their home? Yes. Could a contract be written so that default triggered an automatic lien and expedited foreclosure? Should both parties agree? Yes. Under Arizona revised statutes with the correct language, certain mechanisms can be included. For an afternoon, I was a student again, hunched over pages, underlining their phrases as if they were load-bearing beams. I wrote the contract like I drafted anchor points on a foundation. $100,000, 8% interest, 12 months to repay, collateral, their primary residence. Clause 7, in event of default, the lender retains the right to seize collateral property without additional court proceedings, provided proper notice is given as required by the relevant statute. I underlined that clause in my head. The words were precise. They were legal. They were, in that peculiar way that law and architecture share, an instrument that would produce what you wanted provided you applied it correctly. They came back for the money. Brian swaggered in, convinced of a quick win. Jennifer followed, obedient, trusting me. Their eyes met mine in different places. His scanning for the easiest pressure points, hers searching for the man who had never let her down. I slid the folder across the table. The cashier's check gleamed like a white brick in a package. The pen felt ordinary in my hand. They signed. Jennifer barely read the papers before she signed them. She did what daughters do. She read my face instead of the text. That was something I would later think about with a sorrow that later turned to strategy. I had not intended to take their home. I had intended to attach consequence to irresponsibility. I believed then, as I do now, that accountability is a kinder shape of love than rescue. But the law is a blunt instrument. It knows only terms, not tenderness. They left with the money in their hands and the arrogance of men who think the moment is theirs. For 3 weeks, the house was quiet. Brian paid off what he said he would. Jennifer called with small notes of gratitude. For a short while, I believed I had done the right thing. Then patterns revealed themselves. We are creatures of habit. I turned to the other work. I bought the parcel Kevin had shown me, $45,000 down, an old man's chunk of cash and a signature. The deed came back in my name in mid-March. To anyone who didn't know the rezoning timetable, it was desert scrub. To me, it was a place to stand and watch the city move by. And I called Marcus Webb. He'd been a detective on the Phoenix force for 37 years. And when people stop chasing thrills for the thrill of it, they tend to end up working coffee shops and answering to the slow grind of retirement. Marcus didn't work for the delight of it. He worked for the clarity. He said yes after I explained what I needed. Discrete observations, dates, images, corroboration. He understood the kind of proof that could be made to speak in a courtroom. The first few entries in his notebook were small, almost dull. Dates, addresses, photographs of Brian entering Mill Avenue clubs at odd hours. Then it became pattern. March 28th, 9:47 p.m. Tempe Poker Room. Left 1:23 a.m. April 3rd, same pattern. Returned April 14th despite the loan. The notes accumulated like rivets in a beam, each one adding strength to my structure. It was only when Brian's arrogance returned that I began the second phase. The contract had sealed the transactional world. Now I needed to demonstrate the moral world. Who had exploited whom? I hired a notary review, Amanda Sims, who paged through my contract and told me it was solid, that coercion claims look for threats and misrepresentation, and that without evidence the courts would likely find the contract enforceable. That is a heavy word, enforceable. It means you win because the world follows its rules. Then the lawsuit arrived. Days had a way of turning sooner than you expect. 2 weeks after they signed, Brian filed a complaint. Coercion, duress, exploitation of trust. He wanted the loan voided. When the papers arrived, they felt like stones. I spread them across my table, yellow highlighting accusations. And for the first time in months, I felt the old itch. This time not to build, but to defend. I wrote my statement in longhand first, the slow cadence of the pen soothing. Why had I structured the loan that way? Because I feared for Jennifer. Because the ease of giving had been tried and had failed in my experience. Because patterns, repetition of behavior, tell you what someone will do if enabled. I wrote it for the court, but I also wrote it for myself, so that the eventual ruin of this plan could not be blamed on malice, but would be seen as measured and protective. Marcus came through with a thick packet, photos, times, patterns of behavior. Amanda's review was clean. Patricia Morrison, by chance or God, sat beside me on a courthouse bench that morning when the judge delayed our hearing for 30 minutes. She had the hard look of someone who'd built a life out of numbers. She told me she ran an accounting firm and that she could track financial flows that would expose paradoxes of income and debt. We traded cards. It felt oddly like finding another competent contractor when your own project needs an extra hand. I didn't realize then how important Patricia would become to this design. The hearing was small, the judge more interested in procedure than melodrama. Brian's lawyer practiced a certain kind of theatrics, but theatrics are expensive, evidence is cheaper. Marcus's log read like a construction diary. Dates, locations, repeats. The judge read the contract, which was clean and the product of careful language. In the end, she dismissed Brian's motion to void the loan. Contract appears legally sound, she said. Insufficient evidence of coercion. She looked at me over her glasses and said something else, though not binding. Caution against excessive control of family finances. It sounded like a reprimand. I felt it like a reprimand, but the law had held, and that mattered. Outside the courthouse, Patricia and I talked about tax filings and the manner in which people hide gambling income. She offered to help trace payments and recommended we look deeper, not just at poker rooms, but at credit cards and private lenders. It was a practical sensibility. If you can show that Brian continued to gamble after receiving the loan, his claim that he was coerced into signing unravels like bad stitching. I had not set out for war. I had not intended for my daughter's marriage to become an argument to be won in public. But sometimes the path you set for safety becomes the only defense left when people who prey on weakness get hungry. The law is a practical thing. It cannot wish away the emotional costs. Weeks later, while the city buzzed with the heat of early summer, I framed two things on the wall in my home office. The deed to parcel 447B, where the scrub had started to look like possibility, and the photocopy of the signed loan. Both were pale rectangles of paper. Both were instruments with the power to change lives. When you look at them together, you see the geometry of my plan. One was leverage, the other was security. The two together made a system. I kept moving in the small, efficient ways my profession taught me. Consult a lawyer, hire a detective, buy a parcel of land at the right moment. I prepared the paperwork, the notations, and the logbooks. I sat with a small, private satisfaction the way a man sits with an old set of tools. Not for revenge alone, though there was that, but for order. Someone had threatened my daughter. Someone had tried to convert fear into currency. I remember thinking then, with a clarity that made the desert light look gentle, that there are different kinds of strength. One is the ability to break. Another is the ability to design something that outlasts a threat. On an evening in late June, while the sky went the color of old paint and Patricia and I talked finances and dinner, I realized the plan had become more complicated than protection. It had become a test of character. Brian had believed the world owed him a quick fix. He'd found instead that the world could be patient, and that patience is often a more dangerous thing than rage. When the house eventually went quiet after that last visit, when the legal papers sat in their neat stacks and the desert parcel waited for its rezoning, I felt an odd emptiness. I had acted in a dozen different modes: father, architect, strategist, investor, but beneath them all was a simple thing: a man trying to protect his child in the only way he could control. The rest of the world, however, is messy. People lie. People gamble. People make vows and break them. Contracts can only do so much to tie chaos into order. A month later, at my kitchen table, I closed the ledger on the day's task and felt for the first time in years something I'd forgotten: the pleasant weight of a completed drawing. The blueprint on the table was not a building this time. It was a plan for a life, not just for my daughter, but for me. I had the legal notes, the surveillance reports, the deed. I had patience. What I didn't have yet was the end I intended. I had set things in motion, put my pieces on the board, and waited for other players to move. There is a certain humility in waiting as a man of action. The humility to accept that time will do much of the work you've planned for it. The pieces we put into place had a geometry to them. I was simply the architect who'd given the city its lines. That night, as the Sonoran sky pulled itself over the rooftops and the air grew cool in that particular desert way, I placed a pen on the contract and wrote a note in the margin: for Jennifer. It was stupid and sentimental and entirely needed. I put the paper into the safe and closed it slowly, as if to make sure that no one could rip the space between my daughter and the consequences she'd been asked to bear alone. Brian had come to my door thinking it was a threshold he could walk across with impunity. He had no idea he'd stumbled into a design that would show him, if he lived long enough to see it, how tidy and inexorable the world can be when a man with 35 years of building experience decides to build something else: consequences. The morning sun had already started its climb, burning through the thin curtains of my study, when I woke to the sound of a text message. "We'll come by at 10. Brian says he's ready to sign." Jennifer's words were polite, but there was strain in the punctuation, the kind of careful spacing someone uses when they're trying to sound calm. I looked around the room at the piles of blueprints that once defined my life, at the heavy drafting desk that now held only legal documents and coffee stains. It was strange. I used to design buildings. Now I was designing consequences. By 9:45, the house smelled faintly of cedar and black coffee. The contracts sat on the table, freshly printed, clipped, and signed on my end. The notary, Amanda Sims, a professional woman in her 40s with a neutral expression that could belong to either a banker or an undertaker, sat in the corner. She sipped coffee silently. At exactly 10:02, a car engine groaned outside. Tires crunched over gravel. Then the sound of heels, slow and hesitant. Jennifer entered first. She wore a navy dress that once would have looked elegant on her, but today it seemed like something borrowed, like she'd forgotten how to fill her own shape. Her eyes avoided mine. Then Brian came in. Same smirk, same scent of cologne and ego. "Morning, Mr. Parker," he said, as if this were a friendly business brunch. "Morning," I replied. I didn't offer him coffee. He sat across from me, glancing at the papers like a predator, scanning a menu. "So this is just a formality, right? I take the 100 grand, I pay it back, and everyone's happy." "That's right," I said evenly. "Just sign where indicated." He flipped through the pages, eyes skimming paragraphs he didn't understand. He wasn't reading, he was pretending. He didn't know that every line had been carved like a chisel through marble. Every phrase had been tested against law, logic, and experience. Jennifer stood beside him, wringing her hands. "Dad, is this really necessary? Couldn't you just—" "Sweetheart," I interrupted softly, "this isn't about trust. It's about protection. For you." Amanda, the notary, slid her chin forward. Brian didn't hesitate. He scribbled his signature on every page, tapping the pen impatiently after each flourish. Jennifer followed, slower, eyes flickering up to me as if asking for permission to believe that everything would be okay. When Amanda stamped the last page with her seal, a small sound echoed. the crisp thump of permanence. That's it, I said. The loan is official. Brian grinned, flashing teeth that had probably charmed more than a few gullible investors. Perfect. I'll make good on this, Ron. You'll see. You'll even thank me when I pay you back with interest. I look forward to that, I said quietly. He thought he'd beaten me. He thought this old man was desperate for gratitude. What he didn't realize was that the real payment had already begun, not in dollars, but in the slow inevitability of consequence. That evening, after they left, I sat on my porch watching the horizon turn copper. The desert had a strange kind of honesty. You could see for miles, yet still feel trapped. My coffee had gone cold. I didn't drink it. Marcus called. Got something for you, he said. He'd been keeping tabs on Brian since the day after that first visit. You were right about him. Your son-in-law's not just in debt. He's in business with people who like their money fast and their excuses short. He sent me photos. Brian in a dim poker room, cigarette smoke swirling around him, piles of cash spread across a green felt table. Another shot, him laughing with a man I recognized from a local arrest report years ago. Marco Diaz, known loan shark and part-time casino runner. I scrolled through the pictures slowly. Each one was a nail in the coffin Brian was building for himself. Keep watching, I told Marcus. Document everything. Every meeting, every bet, every time he withdraws cash. You got it, he said. But what's the end game here, Parker? You trying to scare him straight? No, I said after a pause. I'm building something. Marcus chuckled. You architects are all the same. The following week, Brian started calling. At first, polite check-ins. Just letting you know the debts are handled. Then cockier messages. See, old man? Told you I could turn things around. I didn't respond. I let him talk to silence. People like Brian hate silence. It's a mirror that reflects their lies too clearly. By mid-March, Marcus's reports painted a familiar picture. Late nights, bar tabs, poker rooms, and whispers of new debts. Brian wasn't saving. He was sinking again. Jennifer, meanwhile, called me one evening with her voice trembling like old glass. Dad, Brian wants to buy into a friend's business. He says it's a sure thing. What kind of business? Real estate flipping? He says he needs 50,000 more. Of course he did. Men like him always needed just one more sure thing. I told her I couldn't help. I told her money wasn't a ladder for people who kept jumping into holes. She cried quietly, as if ashamed to still love the man who'd built those holes. After the call, I opened my safe again. I looked at the signed loan contract, at the notary's seal, and at the quiet perfection of it all. It wasn't revenge yet. It was preparation. On March 27, Brian showed up at my door again. No Jennifer this time. He looked rough, pale, sweat on his forehead, shirt wrinkled. I need more time, he said. You have 12 months, I reminded him. No, I mean on the payments. I got a delay with the guys I'm working with. Just a small setback, you understand. He laughed nervously, eyes darting. I understand perfectly, I said, but you signed a contract. The terms are clear. His smirk faltered. You wouldn't really enforce that, would you? Not on family? Family doesn't extort family, I said. You started this as a transaction. Let's keep it that way. He stared at me for a long moment, and something mean flickered in his eyes, a thin, hard light that made my skin crawl. Then he leaned forward, voice low. You think you're smarter than me, old man. You think this paper protects you? You don't know the kind of people I deal with. You don't want me desperate. I met his glare with calm. Desperation is a kind of clarity, Brian. It shows people who they really are. He slammed his fist against the table hard enough to rattle the pen holder, then stormed out. When the door closed, I didn't move for a long time. I just stared at the faint impression of his handprint on the wood, an outline of anger. Then I reached for my notebook and wrote, Phase 2 begins. 2 days later, I met Patricia Morrison again. We'd bumped into each other at the courthouse weeks ago, and this time she brought spreadsheets. Her hands were steady, her mind sharper than any contractor I'd ever worked with. You were right, she said, sliding a laptop toward me. Your son-in-law has opened 3 new credit cards in the last 60 days. 2 are maxed out. He also took a personal loan under Jennifer's name without telling her. My jaw clenched. How much? 34,000, give or take. She looked at me across the table. You planning to press charges? Not yet, I said. I'm planning to teach him what gravity feels like when there's no one left to hold him up. Patricia smiled, not coldly, but knowingly. That's a dangerous lesson, Mr. Parker. I'm an architect, I said. We build things that last. By April, the silence between Jennifer and me had grown heavy. She'd stopped calling. I suspected she'd begun to believe Brian's version, that I'd manipulated him, trapped him. That's what men like him do. They rewrite the narrative before the truth has a chance to surface. Then one morning, a manila envelope arrived on my doorstep. Legal notice. Brian Turner versus Ronald Parker. Claim, financial coercion and emotional distress. I read it twice, slowly, then I smiled. The blueprint was working. The morning the lawsuit arrived, Ronald was pruning his roses, the same red roses he'd planted the day his daughter was born. The sky above Phoenix was sharp blue, clean and endless. But when the courier handed him the thick brown envelope, it felt like a storm had rolled in from nowhere. Brian Turner versus Ronald Parker. Financial coercion and emotional distress. The words hit harder than he expected. For a moment, he stood motionless, shears still in hand, the smell of cut stems in the air. Then he laughed, a dry, bitter laugh that frightened even him. He walked back inside, poured a cup of black coffee, and read through every line. Brian's lawyer had written a masterpiece of manipulation, accusing Ronald of using emotional influence and paternal authority to extort and humiliate his son-in-law. The document demanded $250,000 damages. Ronald closed the file, leaned back and whispered to himself, "So this is how you want to play, Brian." Instead of fear, Ronald felt something he hadn't in years. Focus. The kind of laser precision that once guided his hand when drawing blueprints for skyscrapers. Every line, every angle, every detail mattered. He knew exactly what to do. He called his attorney, David Larkin, a quiet man with 30 years of courtroom experience and a reputation for turning chaos into order. "David," Ronald said calmly, "I'm being sued for helping my daughter's husband not get himself killed. I want you to defend me, and I want him destroyed legally, not emotionally. He's not worth the emotion." David chuckled. "Then let's build our case brick by brick, like one of your towers." That afternoon, Ronald met Marcus Webb, the retired detective he'd hired months earlier. Marcus arrived with a manila folder filled with photos, receipts, and casino records. "He's been back at the tables," Marcus said, laying out the evidence like cards on a poker table. Bellagio, Golden Nugget, and a few underground joints near Scottsdale. "Your boy's chasing losses again." Ronald studied the photos. Brian at poker tables, drinks in hand, eyes hollow but greedy. Every image was a nail in his own coffin. "Good," Ronald said, his voice steady. "Keep watching. Don't stop until I tell you to." When the court date finally came, Brian strutted in like a man convinced the system owed him a favor. He wore a new gray suit, probably rented, and an overconfident smirk that made Jennifer shrink in her seat. She looked torn, the daughter who once adored her father, now caught between two men who hated each other. The judge, Honorable Miriam Cole, entered the room. The trial began. Brian's lawyer spoke first, smooth, eloquent, and utterly false. "Your Honor," he began, "my client, Mr. Turner, was manipulated under duress to sign a fraudulent financial contract. Mr. Parker, a man of considerable means, exploited his daughter's emotional vulnerability to impose a predatory agreement." Ronald sat still, hands folded, eyes never leaving the judge. He had been in boardrooms where millions were on the line. This courtroom was no different. Then it was David Larkin's turn. His voice was calm but sharp as glass. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not a case of coercion. It is a case of irresponsibility. My client extended financial aid, legally documented, properly notarized, and willingly accepted. We have witnesses, bank records, and most importantly," he paused, holding up a photograph, "proof that the plaintiff continued gambling within days of receiving the funds." The courtroom murmured. One by one, David presented evidence. Marcus's surveillance photos, casino transaction logs, Brian's text messages bragging about getting easy money from the old man. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Turner, is it true that you visited 3 casinos within a week of signing this agreement? Brian stammered, those weren't, I was just meeting friends. Ronald watched silently as the man who once threatened him now twisted in his own lies. By the end of the day, Judge Cole's verdict was clear. This court finds no evidence of coercion or financial abuse. Case dismissed. The plaintiff is ordered to cover all legal costs. Brian froze. His lawyer looked ready to disappear into the floor. Jennifer covered her face, unable to look at either of them. Outside the courthouse, Ronald stepped into the sunlight. He expected relief. Instead, he felt emptiness. Winning didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation. As he walked toward his car, he heard a soft voice behind him. Mr. Parker? He turned. A woman in her 50s, elegant and confident, stood nearby. She introduced herself as Patricia Morrison, an accountant who'd been in the audience taking notes for another client. You handled that beautifully, she said. It's rare to see someone win by precision rather than rage. Ronald smiled faintly. Architects don't build with rage, Ms. Morrison. We build with structure. She laughed, a genuine warm sound he hadn't heard in years. Well, she said, handing him her card, if you ever want to talk finance or life, I'm better company than your son-in-law. He slipped the card into his pocket, nodded once and walked away. He didn't know it yet, but Patricia would become more than a financial ally. She would become the missing piece in the design of his final masterpiece, the one that would bury Brian Turner for good. Patricia's office smelled of paper and peppermint mints. It fitted her, efficient, clean lines, nothing left to chance. She sat across from me with a laptop open and a stack of printouts arranged like a small, orderly city. Her eyes moved fast, the way a good accountant lets numbers speak for themselves. Numbers rarely lie, people did. Look, she said, turning the screen so I could read. He's still gambling, but what's worse is he's creating new liabilities faster than he can account for them. Credit cards, short-term personal loans, 1 or 2 cash advances. This isn't temporary, it's compounding. I traced a finger down the columns of figures. The pain of arithmetic is a particular kind of clarity. 1 wrong decimal, 1 unchecked swipe of plastic, and a life rearranges itself into defaults and collectors. Brian's balance sheet looked like a house with termites. What do you propose? I asked. Her answer was practical and morally neutral. Restructure the loan, make it feel like help, but make the math heavier in the wing run. Lower immediate payments to ease his cash flow, extend the term, and raise the interest. He takes it because it feels like relief, but it increases the principal over time. Pair that with a limited investment opportunity tied to your land that requires a quick cash injection. He'll bite. It was a trap dressed as a lifeline. I liked traps when they were honest about their purpose. We drafted the amendment, extend from 12 to 18 months, interest bumped to 12%, monthly payments reduced. Patricia modeled the numbers in a spreadsheet and slid it across the desk. The small print read like a scaffolding plan. Restructuring was optional. Acceptance required signature. Failure to meet 2 consecutive payments would trigger Clause 9, an accelerated default provision with immediate lien rights. Clear, lawful, and surgically precise. We sent the offer through Craig, my attorney, not directly. Men like Brian hated to feel humiliated by an elder, so a buffer softened the presentation. Within 2 days he called. His voice had the weary urgency of the desperate. All right, he said, I can do that. Lower payments sound good. I can breathe. He sounded as if he'd just found air at the bottom of a pool. Then sign, I said simply. He did. The restructuring took hold, like mortar settling around bricks. For a while it worked in the way any good architecture works, stabilizing the immediate load. But stabilization was not the end. It was only the technique that allowed a larger design to be implemented. That larger design required bait. Gamblers are sensual to the idea of sudden upside. Patricia suggested, almost conversationally, that I offer Brian a chance to buy into the parcel's projected upside. Not the whole stake, but a meaningful piece, 40% for $80,000. He would need to secure that money with a high-interest loan if he couldn't produce it, which played to his temperament. The agreement would stipulate a transfer schedule, a tight closing timeline, and crucially, a clause giving me the right to withhold transfer until certain milestones were met. In short, I could control the sale timing. I thought about it like a fad I'd designed to lure the wrong people into overreaching. If Brian wanted to play investor, let him gamble with paper and signatures for once. When I mentioned it to him over coffee at a neutral diner, I watched the change cross his face. At first there was suspicion, a man smelling a setup, then greed. "What's the price?" he asked. 80,000, I said. 40% stake, immediate funding required. He didn't have it. He never had the patience for saving. But he had creditors and crooked lenders who liked to turn desperation into interest. Within days, he'd taken out a predatory personal loan, 80,000 at 15% from a small private outfit with a reputation that made my skin crawl. He signed the promissory note in a parking lot, hands shaking only slightly from adrenaline or fear. I couldn't tell which. Patricia and I watched as Brian layered liabilities on top of liabilities. We tracked payments and modeled outcomes. The sum of his obligations soon became obscene. The restructured loan at 135,000, the new investment debt at 80,000, existing credit cards and private debts around 34,000, total obligations roughly 250,000, triple his declared annual income. The math was merciless and in its way, beautiful. People don't often see the shape of their own ruin until they're inside the frame. Meanwhile, the rezoning notice became official. Parcel 4447B was included in the commercial development, and appraisers started to price land accordingly. What had been scrub and possibilities became street value. I had not planned to sell the land immediately, but the new valuation, nearly 4 times my purchase price, provided leverage beyond simple cash. It offered bargaining chips, market optics, and most important, pressure. We tightened the screws in ways the law allowed. The restructuring contract included automatic default triggers. The investment agreement contained transfer milestones and deadlines. I made sure to keep every step legal, every wording defensible. The intent wasn't to humiliate, it was to create consequence. For a man who had built his life on immediate wants, the slow architecture of debt would be a harsher teacher than any lecture. It worked. Brian's short-term relief came at the cost of long-term suffocation. For a few months he managed to stay afloat, paying minimums, leaning on promises and temporary luck. But luck is a poor foundation. He took the bait. He bought into my proposed stake, mortgaged pieces of his future, and convinced himself he was investing in a comeback. Jennifer, who had been distant for so long, began to phone more frequently at odd hours. Sometimes she asked harmless questions about the property, as if trying to stitch herself back into a world that had been rearranged. Other times she begged me, voice small and hurt, to be reasonable. I was reasonable, brutally so. Protection for her future meant creating a system where irresponsibility carried measurable cost. The afternoons blurred into spreadsheets and meetings. Patricia and I met weekly, her practical laugh cutting through the tension. We ran numbers, drafted contingencies, and sometimes simply ate in companionable silence. There was a new rhythm in my life: coffee, calculations, the steady accrual of consequences. Patricia's presence calmed the edges of my plan. She understood leverage. She also, I noticed, understood me in ways that surprised me. The way a man who has built towers recognizes another who counts margins with equal tenderness. By midsummer, Brian's veneer started to crack. Calls from collectors came more often. Missed payments began to punctuate his month. He borrowed against everything he could, including questionable payday instruments that drained his available cash at usurious rates. I watched the graph of his solvency slide toward red, like a caution light illuminated in the dashboard of a car on a steep decline. The web we'd spun didn't rely on malice. It relied on math. Debt compounds. Interest accumulates. Missed payments accelerate default. The law enforces clauses once signed. One evening, I sat on my back patio as the desert cooled and ran through the sequence again in my head. Each decision had been a beam placed precisely. Each signature had been a rivet. A man had threatened my daughter with a chilling calm. I had met that calm with my own. Not with violence. With patience and design, I felt no triumph. I felt only the steady confirmation that structures behave as they're built to behave. Brian called that night, voice edged with panic I hadn't heard before. "Ronald, there's a problem," he said. "They want payment now. The investment lenders are calling. I can't get out from under it." "Then call your lawyer," I said. There was a long pause. "Are you going to, enforce it?" "Yes," I said. "I'll enforce what was signed." He hung up before I could say more. The act was simple and final. The trap was not a sudden snare, but a mechanism whose teeth closed as arithmetic demanded. In the quiet that followed, I found myself thinking not of ruin for punishment's sake, but of the lesson that remains when a man loses everything he had thought owed to him. Accountability can be the only thing that teaches truth. The web tightened. The desert parcel waited like an immovable witness. And as the heat of the summer settled, so did the inevitability of what would come next. By mid-July, the Arizona sun had turned the streets into mirrors of heat, the kind that made even time feel warped and sluggish. Brian's phone calls became more frequent, first pleading, then angry, then desperate again, cycling like the stages of grief. Each message left on my answering machine carried the same tremor. "I just need more time. Just a little more time, Ronald." Time. That was the one resource he never learned to respect. The trap didn't close all at once. It tightened gradually like a structure settling under its own weight. Missed payments triggered penalties. Penalties compounded into defaults. Defaults activated the foreclosure clause. Patricia monitored every number, every notice filed, every document processed. By early August, the paperwork was ready. All that remained was my signature. I stared at the line for a long moment before writing my name. Ronald Parker. Ink. Dry and deliberate. The motion was small, but the effect was absolute. Within 2 weeks, the deed to Brian and Jennifer's house legally transferred to me. The process was clean. No drama, no confrontation. Just math and law doing what they were designed to do. When Jennifer came to see me, she didn't knock. She just walked in, eyes red from sleepless nights, clutching a stack of envelopes, foreclosure notices, debt summaries, legal warnings. She dropped them on my kitchen counter like a confession. "Did you do this?" she whispered. I didn't lie. "Yes." She stared at me, tears blurring her vision. "Dad, he's my husband." "And you're my daughter," I said quietly, "and I will not let a man who threatened you destroy your life because you're afraid to walk away." She sat down, defeated. "He says you ruined him." I looked out the window at the desert horizon. He ruined himself. I just drew the blueprint. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not hateful. I poured her tea the same way I used to when she was a teenager, heartbroken over school dances and broken promises. This heartbreak was larger, but the ritual was the same. By September, Brian was officially bankrupt. The creditors came first: repo men, collection agencies, lawyers who spoke in invoices. Then came the gamblers he owed, the kind that didn't use paper. He disappeared for days at a time, resurfacing only to shout at Jennifer or leave cryptic voicemails about getting back on top. But there is no top when you've fallen through your own foundation. The day I sold the desert parcel, the sky was oddly cool. The land, once worth a modest $45,000, sold for $180,000. The profit was neat, symmetrical. I deposited the check, then transferred half of it into a trust under Jennifer's name. She didn't know it yet, not until the dust settled, but that trust would be the cornerstone of her recovery. When Patricia and I met to finalize the sale, she smiled softly. "You've done it," she said. "No," I replied. "I finished it. There's a difference." She tilted her head. "Do you feel satisfied?" I thought for a moment. Satisfaction wasn't the word. What I felt was stillness, the kind that follows a storm you have seen coming for months. "I feel balanced," I said finally. She nodded, understanding, without pressing. We signed the final papers, and just like that, the blueprint was complete. Weeks later, I received a letter from Jennifer. She'd left Brian. She'd found an apartment downtown and a part-time job teaching art to children. Her handwriting wavered, but the message was steady. I hate how this happened, but maybe it had to. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, but I understand now. You didn't destroy him, you stopped him. I'm trying to rebuild, Dad. Maybe one day we can start again too. I read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it in my desk drawer, next to the deed that bore my name. Brian, from what I heard later, moved to Nevada. Word through an old friend said he was tending bars somewhere near the outskirts of Henderson, far from the tables, far from the stakes. Maybe the lesson finally reached him. Maybe not. It wasn't my concern anymore. One evening, Patricia and I sat on the porch as the sun set, that long gold wash of light over the desert. She handed me a glass of bourbon, her smile soft. "So, Mr. Architect," she said playfully, "what will you build next?" I looked at her, the woman who had stood beside me through the structure of revenge, now sitting beside me in quiet companionship. "Something simpler," I said. "Something that doesn't collapse." She laughed gently, and for the first time in years, the sound didn't echo off empty walls. When the last light faded, I stood and looked out over the desert, the same land that had been both weapon and redemption. Revenge, I realized, isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's construction, building consequences so sturdy they outlast the rage that birthed them. I went back inside, turned off the lights, and placed the framed deed beside the letter from my daughter. Two testaments, one to design, the other to forgiveness. And in that quiet house, surrounded by blueprints, I finally felt what I hadn't in years: peace.